Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. Housing affordability, or the lack thereof, and the historically low vacancy rates which have pushed up, skyrocketed actually, rents, have been blamed on the large number of overseas migrants coming to Australia. So what would happen if we stopped immigration? Well, that's what I'm going to be discussing today with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. However, I just want to explain this is a special episode of a new second podcast that I'm delivering to you each week with Simon. Over the last 4 years, Simon Kuestenmacher has been one of the most popular regular guests on this podcast, and because we both believe that demographics is going to be one of the main drivers of our property markets, of business and the economy moving forward, we're publishing a separate podcast that we're calling Demographics Decoded, where we're going to unravel the trends that are going to shape the future of your investment decisions, business strategies and organisational planning. Now, while you're hearing the show today on the Michael Yardney podcast, it's just my way of letting you know about it because Demographics Decoded has its own channel on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. I'm running it here to give you a taste of what's ahead, but please stop for a moment and look for the Demographics Decoded podcast on whichever podcast app you're listening to this on or on YouTube and subscribe to that show as well. I'll leave a link in the show notes to make it easy. Anyway, what would happen if we stopped immigration or even slowed it down considerably? That's what we're going to discuss. So let's get on with the show.
Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. In today's episode, we're going to discuss immigration to Australia and in particular, whether Australia is ready for zero migration, as some people are suggesting. Look, we're currently having a housing crisis with not enough accommodation. And what about our burgeoning population? But being an election year, I'm sure we're going to hear much more about immigration levels. So there's lots to talk about with reducing immigration numbers. Now, Simon, I know in your articles in the New Daily every Saturday, which are not behind a paywall, so our listeners and our viewers can follow you on the New Daily every weekend and also once a month in the Australian New Right. You keep us up to date with things that are going on and how demographics are going to change. But I know you have considered the question of the impact that reducing or stopping our immigration would cause. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so the idea why we look at this extreme scenario of not just cutting migration by a couple of tens of thousands or 100,000 people, but going to zero migration is to really see the stark difference. Sometimes you want to go to an extreme scenario to see and understand what this particular variable actually does do for you. And so it's a nice intellectual experiment, but it also shows quite a few stark trends to spoil a bit already.
Well, let's start with what's currently our immigration policy and the impact on population growth. What's our baseline?
Well, Australia very much is a migration nation. That means we got used to growing our population based on immigration. As a rule of thumb, you can remember whenever you hear a population growth number in Australia, 2/3 of that is made up of overseas migration, and only 1/3 of this growth is being made up from more babies being born than people die each year. It's called natural increase. This natural increase number will eventually run dry. We already make babies at the lowest rate ever, 1.6 babies per woman. Sometimes we call this the birth rate. It's technically called the total fertility rate, but birth rate is okay enough as a phrase. And so we say as birth rates lower and lower and lower, we can't grow the population. The reason we're still growing based on natural increase is that people just live essentially forever. We now can easily expect a newborn person to be living well into their 90s. If you see a baby, you go like you probably make it till your mid-90s. It's quite astonishing to think how fast that changed. But it means that if we still want to then counteract the aging of the population that we discussed in last week's podcast, we need migration to soften that, because migrants are young people. Migrants that we take in are 18 to 39 or thereabouts. That's the vast majority. Well over 75% of migrants fall into that bracket. So we can keep the aging to a minimum We're still aging, but we can minimize it. And it's a deliberate strategy to make sure that we don't run out of workers. Quite often, this migration strategy is criticized for saying it is too big. We're importing too many people into a system that does not have enough housing, does not have enough infrastructure. Yes, cutting migration, as we will discuss today, I argue, creates more problems than it solves.
Well, part of the government's mandate is to expand our economy, to grow our country. And I'm not an economist, but I've been a student of economics for many decades. And as far as I can see, there's three ways our economy could grow, Simon. Taking on extra debt. Well, we've got way too much of that already, and we understand that. Improving productivity. And this may be helped a little bit with AI, artificial intelligence, but I'm not sure that's the full answer. Or by expanding the market size. And in the meantime, I think that's what the government's doing, isn't it? Expanding our market by attracting young immigrants when people come here, they've got to buy a television and furniture and refrigerators, and they earn money and they pay taxes. That's one of the, I think, ways the government's greasing the wheels of industry. They're not going to give that up, are they?
No. There's no treasurer that I could imagine that would purposefully cut a main source of income. I don't see that to be plausible. There's a political talk. There will always be political talk about cutting migration because it is very convenient. Traditionally, this is being done by politicians that are nearing an election. So usually if an election is 3 or 6 months out, this talk goes up, and then you just know what's happening. It's an easy way to win votes. It's always nice and convenient to blame a housing crisis, for example, on migration. Which is, is fair enough. There's a plausible argument in it. It says if there are more people, we need to build more houses. We don't have enough workers to build houses to satisfy all the demand. So how dumb are we to increase migration in times of a housing shortage? Sounds plausible enough, but it disregards that we saw during the pandemic. We saw migration outflow. We saw negative migration into the country. All the while we saw the highest house price rise ever, which of course was aided by super low interest rates. But it also has to do with developers obviously timing when they put things to market. It makes no sense to do it otherwise. There we are in this scenario, and a government that wanted to fix housing, they could do this in other ways than tackling migration. But migration then needs to act as a scapegoat so that governments can actually pretend to be tackling housing without actually tackling housing, because tackling housing affordability essentially means making housing cheaper, making the house that you own worth less money. And since in this country still 2/3 of the population lives in a house they own, they have no interest in becoming, poorer through that strategy. So therefore we just scoot along like this and not actually tackling housing affordability at scale just yet. It will happen eventually, but that's the topic for another column.
You're right. So we've talked about why we need working citizens to come in to help our economy. So some people say, well, that's okay. Well, don't let the students in. But boy, that's a very important industry for us, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. International students are an export industry for us. That sometimes sounds confusing because exports is obviously the stuff that we take from Australia and we sell to the rest of the world, even though international students come into Australia. But it has to do with the monetary flows associated with this. And Australia as an economy is super simplistic. We are not a complex economy. Australia does 4 things and 4 things alone to make money. Mining, that we sell that stuff to the world. Agricultural produce we sell to the world. International education and tourism. That's all we do. This is not a very complex economy. If we cut into one of those 4 pillars, I don't see why you would do this. I don't see how this would possibly benefit the economy as a whole. Therefore, I would say no plausible government will severely cut any of those 4 sectors.
Well, they're talking about lowering student numbers, but if they did, our universities, our houses of higher education are dependent on this income. Either local students are going to have to pay more, or they're going to stop some of the research and some of the academia, and that wouldn't be good for Australia, would it?
No, not at all. And so, yes, we're already seeing those policies in place. We are tightening restrictions on those dodgy visa visa mills, degree mills, whatever you want to call them, those dodgy institutions. I would argue that the big universities will be absolutely fine, that they will continue to get international students. That benefits the economy. It also creates good international relations with other countries. It binds us closer to the rest of the world. Ultimately, we benefit from this. But I just mentioned our simplistic business model of mining, agriculture, tourism, and international education. And this is a nice reminder of why these arguments that I hear quite often about, hey, I hear you talk about the importance of migration, but look at Japan. Japan as an industry, what this powerful economic player of Japan, they have seen their population decline. They really drive a minimalistic migration scheme, and yet they manage to grow their economy. Why don't we just follow the Japanese model? We need to remember that Japan operates on a completely polar opposite business model than Australia. They exclusively make their money by high-tech manufacturing and insurance. Those sectors, you can easily plonk your factories or your offices into another country. Toyota builds a factory in Vietnam, and they use Vietnamese labor to build cars. And then they're only re-importing the exports, the profits. That is something that Australia cannot do. Mining, agriculture, tourism, education, that all needs workers in the country. In order to grow our industry, we need more people. That means we need to import them. So unless we completely redo the whole economic setup of Australia, which we could do theoretically, but we won't because it makes no sense, then we will see a continuation of the high migration approach.
I just want to interrupt this show for a moment to remind you that while you're listening to this particular episode on the Michael Yardney podcast feed, this show really is an episode of my new Demographics Decoded podcast that I deliver each week with Simon Kuestenmacher. And boy, has that show gained traction, ranking amongst the top business and investing podcasts in Australia. So even though you received it on the Michael Yardney podcast feed, please take a second to stop the show now and search for Demographics Decoded and subscribe on the same podcast app you're listening to the show now or on YouTube, because we also have a video of each show. Now, to make life easy, I'll be including links in the show notes. And I just wanted to again remind you that I'm only running occasional episodes of Demographics Decoded here, so you get to understand the type of things Simon and I are talking about. And I look forward to sharing 2 shows with you each week, the Michael Yardney podcast, twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, which we spend time talking about property, success, money and wealth, and every Wednesday, Demographics Decoded, where Simon Kuestenmacher and I unveil the trends shaping your future. Now, we spoke about our ageing population in the last podcast. By the way, if you haven't listened to that, subscribe to the Demographics Decoded podcast on whichever podcast player you're listening to this, or on YouTube, and go back to last week's show where we discussed our ageing population. But Simon, your conclusion when we discussed this last week was that with no or minimal migration, our ageing population, or the percentage of our populations that's old, is going to increase. And boy, that's going to create even more challenges.
Absolutely. There are quite a few jobs that very, very much rely on foreign workers. Aged care workers are one of those examples. If there are no cheap imported workers from overseas, nobody is looking after the old people. And that is something we cannot afford. And you can measure this in the ABS data quite easily. What dependency does my job, my industry have on foreign workers? It's quite a lot. On the average, a third of all jobs are held by workers from overseas. That's a lot. You minimize this and you run out of workers. And that can be quite serious.
Now, what about urban and compared to rural, regional differences? What would migration or lower migration or no migration do to that? Because I guess most immigrants are coming to our capital cities.
Yes, initially. You want to remember, when you are a migrant from overseas, you don't know Australia. You have no idea how this whole weird country works. You know one address and one address only when you come to the country. That's either your university address or it's your place of work. And then you tend to move as close as possible to that address. Overwhelmingly, jobs and universities cluster in the inner cities, in the CBDs of our biggest cities. That means migrants initially move into the inner city of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth. That's what they do. Then after a while, after hanging out with their new friends, their new co-workers for quite a while, after they had so many discussions about the property market at the water cooler, after a couple of years in Australia, they start behaving like everyone else on the housing market, and they then do end up segregating based on wealth, income. That's what they then do. But in the meantime, that means, well, the inner city would immediately struggle if you were to cut migration down to zero. They would go absolutely ghost townish. But you go, well, whatever, maybe you hate the inner city, maybe that doesn't faze you. What about regional Australia? So regional Australia is struggling to grow its population base. There are a few regional hubs that are within a 2-hour drive time radius of the big CBDs. They saw growth because they increasingly act and function as dormitory suburbs, meaning they attract workers from the inner city that move there as soon as they make families. And then those workers only commute back into the city once or twice a week, and they try to work remotely as much as they can. That's what's happening within the 2-hour drive time radius. All regional towns that are more than 2 hours away from a major CBD, they are aging like crazy. And in order to attract a population, they need to provide jobs, housing, affordable housing, and schooling. And many of those areas struggle to provide all of those three. And these areas are at the severe risk of bleeding population, of shrinking back and forth. These regional areas have a much lower share of migrants than the big inner cities. But if you take those few migrants away, they stand no chance. Then those towns immediately get the lifeblood sucked out of them. And once a town falls below a certain threshold, a small regional town, then certain kind of functions are not financially viable. So you see the healthcare services move away. At some point, the local supermarket can't stay open and closes down. And that slowly sucks the lifeblood out of town. The same with the local footy team. If they can't man the team anymore, they need to merge with the evil bastards down the road. And again, why do you stay in this town then? So migrants, even though they are not as numerous in regional Australia, still are absolutely crucial to maintain those services. And we, of course, want to remember that regional Australia is much more multicultural than we do it justice. The least diverse town in Victoria, I think it might be the country, is Horsham. They only have 15% of the population born overseas, much, much lower than a Sydney, where 40% of the population is born overseas. But how does that compare? Well, let's look at Germany. In Berlin, 17% of the population was born overseas. That means Australia is running a very, very successful multicultural experiment. This is fantastic, considering how diverse we are. Melbourne, Sydney, 40% of the population born overseas. We have no anywhere near enough racist incidents. That's a horrible sales pitch. But what I mean by this is...
I'm not sure that's really what you meant to say, Simon, is it?
Not at all. What I mean by this is...
By proportion, though.
Considering how diverse we are, you would expect many, many more conflicts, many more racial incidents to be recorded. But they are not, because ultimately we're doing this really well. And ultimately we are an extremely welcoming society where the multicultural experiment worked out extremely well. We must not undersell ourselves when we talk about it, when we try to, of course, obviously fight all those terrible racist incidents.
Well, I recently read that 86% of last year's overseas immigrants were aged between 15 and 44, which is the working class age that we were speaking about. But I think migration brings in not just the talents that we don't have here, but other skills. for the skills shortage, but it also fosters innovation. I was an immigrant. I came to Australia at the age of 3. There was a Chinese restaurant in most suburbs, an fish and chip shop. I remember when the first pizza restaurant opened up around me. It was called Mergolini's in Glen Huntly Road, Elsternwick, as a teenager. Pizza, what's that? And everyone used to go there on a Saturday night. And now look at the way all these other rich cultures have actually changed our food and our way we dress and our way of life, Simon.
Oh, totally. And Australia has been extremely welcoming of new influences. The cuisine, the kitchen is always the first way that we embrace a new culture. And you saw that the boring potato and steak and dark tea diet of Australia got massively improved as soon as we got the Mediterranean wave of migrants in the 50s and 60s. That actually massively boosted our quality of food, our lifestyle. And then, of course, the Greeks not only gifted us great food, they only gifted us columns at our brick veneers that we enjoyed.
Concrete front yards, yes.
Concrete front yards. No, but we are in all honesty, in all seriousness here, we are taking the best of cultures and we're integrating them in one way or form. It does take a while. And it quite often takes exactly one generation. And every now and then you hear arguments, anti-migration arguments says, well, it was fine with the Italians and the Greeks. Because turns out those people were Christians or they were whites or whatever the narrative there is. And then you go, well, let's have a look at the Vietnamese population. They are not Christians. They're not white. But they came, of course, during the Vietnam War. And now their kids are beautifully integrated. So that is, of course, very tough if you are the first generation and you are not well integrated and you hear all those horrible stories. But we are doing well. And we want to remember that if you talk to the first generation Greek or Italian immigrants, they do not tell you stories of how they were welcome at school. They tell you about absolutely terrible slurs that were exposed to, bullying, good old physical violence as well. So this is not easy peasy, wonderful, seamless integration of a cohort. That takes a while. But we, structurally speaking, did manage to do this in this country.
So interestingly, we started off by asking what's going to happen if we reduce or stop migration. The conversation starts because of the housing crisis, but the two are not really matched. I don't think the housing minister is speaking to the immigration minister. There are other ways of helping our housing crisis, Simon, in my opinion, without ceasing or significantly reducing immigration. In my mind, the benefits of immigration are too strong to even start fiddling with those numbers.
And we're not, to be honest. It's a nice talking.
No, we're not. We've got a business plan to grow our population to 40 million people by the middle of this century, haven't we?
Exactly. And it makes sense for us to continue to do this. We do have enough space in this country. One risk is water, so we need smart water management, but all of this can, technically speaking, be solved. I think we'll continue with this approach. Of course, we do need to be mindful of how do we integrate people. You want to purposefully, deliberately integrate people to society to ensure that social cohesion is not at risk. And social cohesion might be a topic for another column in particular. I keep saying column. This is the newspaper.
Well, just to remind people, you write a weekly column in the New Daily, and that's one way they can get your musings, and similarly in the Australian once a month as well. But now every week we're going to be sharing your thoughts. So this is a great reminder to, if you're enjoying the information Simon's sharing with you, please subscribe to the podcast. I'm not going to keep saying this every week, but since this is a new show, we'd like you to help us by subscribing, but we'd also like you to help us by telling other people about it as well. How did you find out about this podcast? You may have heard it from our social media or from other people. So please pass the message on so we can tell as many people about this great information. Sorry for the shameless plug,
no,
Simon.
A fantastic plug. Thank you for that. Now, what I wanted to remind people of is that we do, of course, need to always worry about social cohesion in the country. That is something that we take for granted, that we are a nation. It is actually, building a nation is much more complex and crazy of an undertaking than you might think. And there are quite a few trends that are risky risking social cohesion in this country. One of them has to do with religion. More and more non-believers means you do not have a common religious belief that holds you together. And of course, the remaining believers in this country increasingly are from a multitude of faiths. It's wonderful if you are part of this faith community, but it doesn't help on a national level. We are completely hollowing out the workforce. We are eroding the Australian middle class. The middle class doesn't provide social cohesion in this country anymore. So just assuming that those institutions can be taken away from the equation without creating any kind of conflict is naive. And so we do need to very purposefully create social cohesion. We need to purposefully reach out and integrate our new migrants into our sporting clubs, into our education system, into our broader neighborhoods. That takes effort. But it is well worth it, because ultimately the experiment of integrating more people into a community leads for a stronger and more diverse community. It's well worth the effort, even though it is actually effort.
Well, those who live in Australia they've won the lottery in life in many ways. Either your parents have ended up here and you've been born in Australia, or you migrated here. And I think we should appreciate living in the best country in the world. And despite all the challenges and the best time in history, and I think once we become successful, as you and I have in our own professions, it's part of our job to help others become successful and make this a country where everyone's got a chance. Here in Australia, everyone has a chance of pursuing their dreams, pursuing the dream of home ownership, pursuing the dream of going into a business or profession if you want. We have won the lottery of life, haven't we, in many ways, Simon, being here. And it's actually having other people to share it with is a great way of doing it.
Yeah, it's still a growth country. So it's quite often, we will also do this in this podcast. We'll point to difficult and challenging situations, but ultimately, a country that grows its population base, that grows its economy, that grows and adds more cities, eventually, it's another topic, to the whole fabric of society. There are plenty of opportunities out there for those ones that are bold enough to actually venture out, and that, of course, have the eye out there for opportunities. So you can definitely very much still make it in a country like this.
Well, we're going to keep giving you indications of how the country is going to change over the future in subsequent podcasts. Now, Simon, next week I'd actually like to talk about the intergenerational report, which is looking out 40 years. That's a long time away. But interestingly, if you go back 40 years, that was only in the 1980s and 90s. So, gee, that wasn't that long ago. I remember 40 years in that direction. So I'd like to get your thoughts about what Australia is going to look like. So if you would like to know yourself as one of the people listening to this or watching this, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'll catch up again next week, Simon.
Fantastic. I'll see you very soon.
This Demographics Decoded podcast was brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property and wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. You can follow me on social media, but I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all the social media platforms. I'll include links in the show notes. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Demographics Decoded podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. You'll be doing them a favour. I hope you will anyway, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to shape their future. And of course, any of the discussion we had today was not personal advice about your future, but just general information to help inform you. Thanks for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from today's show. But before you move on to the next podcast that you're hoping to listen to, Please let me remind you that what you just heard was an episode of another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. We call that show Demographics Decoded, and there we unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. Now, I replay occasional shows on this channel, the Michael Yardney podcast, to make you aware of the other show, but Demographics Decoded is a must-listen-to podcast. It's for anyone who's interested in property investment, business and entrepreneurship. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, just please stop for a second and subscribe on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube, wherever you're listening to this right now. Now, if you did enjoy today's show, the episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, tell somebody else who you think would also benefit from my podcast. Actually, tell them about Demographics Decoded as well. Remember, there's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Or just talk to your friends in the old-fashioned way. Tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour. You're definitely going to be doing me a favour in helping in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. By the way, you can catch up with me in between these shows on social media, or you can join my private Facebook. Just go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. Hey, I've got a special bonus for you too. It's my way of saying thank you for subscribing to this podcast. Just go to podcastbonus.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where we've got a bunch of ebooks and special reports. That's my way of saying thank you for taking the time to listen. Oh, by the way, if you haven't listened to the many, many podcast episodes we've already recorded, you can always listen to the old episodes where each one has lessons about property investment, success and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.